Well, today I wanted to get into the weeds of what happened yesterday on Trevor Phillips' show. He actually held a Conservative MP to account for their 14 years in office and specifically looking at their policy of austerity and what that has meant for our public services, specifically the justice system, and why we're having so many problems. And it was fascinating that he managed to really get into this and show how Britain has time and time again made the wrong decisions. For certain, austerity was justified to fix the black hole of the financial crisis, and all it did was make everything worse. And it's worth thinking about this now because Rachel Reeves is doing exactly the same as what the Conservatives did, in that she's justifying austerity and tax rises to fill a black hole that actually austerity and Brexit has made huge. And it's an insatiable black hole that will continue eating everything, and eventually every single thing that exists in Britain will be privatised unless we manage to bring this to a halt.
There's some responsibility, or your government. You cut funding during the years of austerity. I don't think anybody can argue about that. Experienced staff left, which I'm sure wasn't the intention, but that's what actually happened. I can show you. In 2017, the budget went down from 2010, and it fell to a low point around about 2016. Okay, it's recovered a bit, but nowhere near where it was. And the effect of this, I'll show you another graph. Was actually I can't show you that graph, but I'll tell you what it says. In 2017, the median length of service for prison staff was 12 years. By 2021, that had declined to 4 years. The budget cuts meant that there were great churn and prisons were employing inexperienced people. Wouldn't it do something for honesty in politics if you simply acknowledge that actually some of this is your responsibility?
So, two parts to this. I already said at the beginning of the programme about the fact that we inherited a budget deficit over 10%. That's a country threatened with bankruptcy. We had a note left, there's no money left. Labour even admitted it, right? If you look at that spending...
Yeah, you made a choice.
But the public often don't understand the detail. So let me explain. The difference between a deficit of 4% or so that Labour inherited from us when they won the election in 24 and what we inherited from them in cash terms now is £160 billion. That's the entire NHS budget.
We discuss this a lot in our programme.
But that's why this happens.
Viewers understand that, but you made a choice about where you were going to impose austerity. To be honest. And here it is in prisons.
Trevor, you asked me to be honest, so I'm telling you why it happened honestly, and because of the finances of the country. In terms of the outcomes, the policy outcomes, what does this translate to? We were speaking about accidental releases from prison, right? Now, in every year that we were in office, the average number of accidental releases from prison was about 60.
But you're swerving the question I asked you, which is, do you accept any responsibility for the fact that the budget cuts that you chose to make meant that there were less experienced staff in prisons and they were bound to make the sort of mistakes we're seeing this week? Do you accept no responsibility at all for that?
I am accepting the fact that we had to make those difficult decisions. You've just said you chose to make, implying that we got to office, hey, let's now cut all the spending.
Yeah, I've asked you if you take responsibility. Your answer is three times it's somebody else's fault.
I didn't say that. I said I take responsibility for the fact we had to make very, very difficult spending decisions because of the state the country's finances were in. You're implying that we somehow voluntarily launched this so-called austerity. We didn't. We didn't have the money to fund departments in the way we wanted.
Back in 2005, Polly Toynbee wrote about the Conservative plans to use creative destruction to destroy our public services. And there's no doubt that austerity was used to do that. And again, she wrote another article on their ambitions in 2017. It just defies belief that we now have a Labour government continuing with this agenda and justifying it by blaming Brexit and doing absolutely nothing about Brexit.
They say that you're accepting responsibility for what somebody else did before you came into office, and you're saying that actually it was nothing much to do with you.
Okay, I've said we had to cut spending. So I'm being honest with you on air. Okay. Why do we have to do it? Because the country was on the cusp of bankruptcy. It had a budget deficit north of 10%. That's very, very serious for the country. Now, but you didn't let me finish the point about outcome. Because
wouldn't mind quickly.
Because, as I said, the reason I raised that case in Prime Minister's questions is because the idea of accidental release from prison is incredibly serious. They averaged about 60 every year. We were in office 262 such cases in Labour's first year. But you're asking me about the truth. They're the stats, and that's what matters.
James Cartlett, thank you for your time.
A massive row has broken out on Twitter since Trevor Phillips' show yesterday and his interview with Zack Polanski. And it seems that a lot of accounts are really furious and extremely briefing against Zack Polanski and really going for the jugular. Zack Polanski's interview with Trevor Phillips, I thought, was very skillfully done. He's a gifted communicator, and I think he's got some really valuable points to add to our politics. But I have never been a Green voter. In fact, I was probably quite sceptical about the Green Party. I do think that they've had extreme positions. They were a Brexit party. Nigel Farage used to vote for.
Yeah, I'm a Green Party supporter.
Oh, hello. Yeah, well, I voted Green once.
I understand.
Yeah, no, I did.
When will we rescue you?
Well, no, because I actually always regarded myself, all through the 80s, as an environmentalist. Didn't care about.
Voted for the Green Party in 1989. It is true. It was the European elections of '89, and the Green Party were led by a sensible fella called Jonathan Porritt. I've always been an environmentalist, and I want to see a better, cleaner, greener world. And I voted Green because they were the only Eurosceptic party back in those days, and I was pleased to do so. The chairman of my local Conservative association almost collapsed in the pub that night when I told him.
They have been changing, and under Zack Polanski, they do seem to be changing again. Their position on NATO used to worry me. But things have changed today. A year in of living with Donald Trump back in the White House has had significant impact on Europe, together with the aggression of Putin and what that is meaning for Europe, mixed with Brexit and the reality of how that has played out. So I am more open to thinking about Europe having an army itself to defend itself. Why do we need to be guaranteed by America, particularly when it's got a leader like Donald Trump, who is totally unpredictable? He's even threatening to sue our BBC. And that is rich, given the amount of misinformation that comes out on Fox News from Trump's mouth. It's himself. So I don't think that our best interests are served by America having so much control of our continent. We don't interfere with America. Why are they doing it to us? So really it makes sense that security for Europe is consolidated with European countries. And the way to ensure peace going forward and to deal with Vladimir Putin is for a united Europe to unite and deal with that threat as a united front. So I welcome Zack Polanski's ambition for peace. And there has been a backlash about his comments because they want to make out that he's a pacifist and that it's disrespectful to Ukraine to think that Zack Polanski would negotiate with Vladimir Putin, even though Donald Trump has been negotiating and having long meetings with Vladimir Putin. But there seems to be a very irrational response to what Zack Polanski has said from certain quarters. They are gaslighting him and trivialising him. And we saw this with Jeremy Corbyn to a certain degree. But Jeremy Corbyn was always saying some really positive things in many ways, particularly for the welfare state and the NHS. But the main problem with Jeremy Corbyn is that he was very pro-Brexit, and he actually did have some very antiquated views and romantic views about Russia. And I don't think that that is the case with Zack Polanski. I'm not seeing that. Do I think that Zack Polanski is going to be the next Prime Minister? I don't think so. I can't see that there's any likelihood of that, but there certainly could be a coalition of Greens, Liberal Democrats, and potentially some Labour MPs, which is a much better counterweight to Reform and Conservatives forming a majority. So I welcome Zack Polanski's contributions to our country, and I think it's brilliant that he is getting publicity, and probably the tensions that are playing out, in fact, help him rather than hinder him. But it is worth talking about what it means for us. I grew up with the Troubles in Northern Ireland, which looked like they would never be solved. I grew up also with the Berlin Wall, and that looked like it was always going to be there. People used to be shot trying to escape from the Iron Curtain, and it didn't change gradually. It just happened in a very, very short space of time, and it changed radically. So I do get what Zack is saying, that we have to have ambitions beyond just being in conflict with someone like Vladimir Putin. We have to think, well, at some stage, something might change and there might be opportunity for a different type of relationship. That is grown-up politics.
Your party wants to get rid of nuclear weapons, move to emphasis onto diplomacy, development, and so on and so forth. If Greens were part of a government, would we expect to have fewer men and women under arms by the end of your term of office?
Well, I think that depends what's happening in the world. I think it would always be foolish to assume anything about military budgets without knowing the political context you're working in. I would say more widely, though, if we're talking about right now, we've got a Prime Minister who's spending £15 billion on nuclear weapons and at the same time saying there's no money to lift the two-child benefit cap, for instance, something that's keeping 350,000 children in poverty. So I think it's right to question political choices at budget
surely
time.
The deterrent is valuable in a world that has Vladimir Putin in it.
Well, I want to see everyone denuclearise, including Vladimir Putin. But ultimately, the only way you can do that is by showing...
But I have to say that would be in the realms of the miracle?
Well, you're laughing at it, but I think it's important that we don't laugh at peace. I think it's really important.
No, I'm laughing at the idea that Vladimir Putin is going to give up his nuclear weapons because somebody asks him to.
Well, you could have laughed at the point of Nelson Mandela negotiating with the ANC, or we could have laughed at the Irish during the Troubles.
You're not sincerely making the comparison. Come on.
I am making the comparison. I think it's always impossible until it's done, and I think it's really important. I don't think it's likely. That's a different question. But I think the first question has to be, do you believe that we can work for peace and diplomacy in the world? Do we believe that we can work with people that we have mass disagreement with, that are they're obviously created an illegal invasion of Ukraine? These are really serious issues. And at the same time, I believe we should never leave the negotiating table. And part of that is showing both the moral and courageous leadership to come on TV and say to you, even though this might be a position that's ridiculed, I don't think we should find peace and diplomacy ridiculous. I think we actually, the most brave and courageous and authentic to do is say, I believe we can have a world without war.
So Prime Minister Polanski would negotiate with President Putin?
Undoubtedly. I think it would be sociopathic behaviour to say you wouldn't negotiate with the President or a Prime Minister of any country.
Can I just ask you, before we move on, you're wearing the white poppy as well as the red poppy. What is the implication of that?
The white poppy began after the First World War, mainly from women's groups who were talking about peace and anti-fascism. So on the same day that we're remembering the fallen, it's also looking ahead to the future and saying we want a world of peace.
It's certain that the people who led us through to win the last war and to build the European project, which is the world's most successful peace project, had the same goals in mind, to try and protect and ensure peace for the future. And so I'm with Zack on this. I want a world of peace, and that's why I am always working as hard as I can to ensure that Britain reunites with the EU and we are stronger together and safer together. I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to comment below. And if you haven't subscribed, perhaps think about subscribing.